Everyone, and thanks for watching this special video edition of the Hdinsights podcast. I'm Kevin Gregory, Senior Director of Education and Communications for the Huntington Study Group. And most of the time when we're producing a podcast, it's just an audio connection between us and our guests, whether that connection is through Zoom or they're dialed in by phone. But when I sat down to record with Seth Rotberg, we were both on camera for the duration. So I thought it would be neat to not only share Seth's story to a wider audience than we normally may have, but also wanted to use it to provide our followers who may not be into podcasts or have the right setup for podcasts a special look at what the Hdinsights podcast is all about. You can find more information about the Hdinsights podcast by visiting huntingtonstudygroup.org, or you can search for it on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, or on our streaming platform, which is podbean.com. Once you find it in whatever device you prefer, subscribe to ensure that you always get the latest episodes downloaded when they come out directly to your device. So as I mentioned, you're going to hear from Seth Rotberg. Seth is a patient advocate, community connector, and motivational speaker who's passionate about bringing his personal experience to support the health community. On this episode, we dove right into that and what he considers his most vital work with young adults in the HD community, which is moving the focus from hope to urgency. In 2019, Seth co-founded the nonprofit Our Odyssey to provide year-round social and emotional support to young adults impacted by a rare or chronic condition. He has a master's in nonprofit management from DePaul and currently resides in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Professionally, he works as a patient leader recruitment manager at WeGo Health. So without further delay, here's our special video edition of the Hdinsights podcast with Seth Rotberg. All right, well, Seth, I really appreciate you joining the Hdinsights podcast today, and it's a pleasure to speak with you. I know a lot of people in the HD community are familiar with your story, but I'm sure there's still a healthy population of people out there that aren't as familiar with it. And you tell the story the best. So I certainly don't want to take any of the wind out of your sails. But again, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I appreciate you inviting me on to share a little bit about my story and some of the work I'm doing in the space to really help make a difference in the community.
Well, let's start with your history, your personal history and experience with your family and Huntington's disease. Starting there, I know you've been an open book with your diagnosis, but take us back. What is your earliest kind of memory of where Huntington's disease started to impact you in your life?
So I think it started probably in 2005 when I was 15 years old. And I did that math right. Yeah, I did the math right. And that's when my mom was first diagnosed with Huntington's disease. But I think the prior, few years leading up to that, we knew something was off with her. We just didn't know what it was. And not just with Huntington's disease, but with a lot of rare diseases, there tends to be a misdiagnosis, can be 5 to 7 years, even longer. And we were noticing that my mom had those, drunk-like movements, the slurred speech, and she had the mood swings where one minute her and I are talking, the next, we're in an argument or she's upset about something, and then, snap of the finger and everything's fine again. And at the time, the doctors said, oh, maybe she just, has mood swings or bipolar disorder or major depression. But that didn't explain, those wobbly movements. And so it actually took like a small family intervention. I remember, again, being 15 at the time or around that age. And my older sister was off to college. So it was my dad and I. My mom's getting worse. We're running out of options. So my dad, myself, my 2 aunts, my uncle, one night sat her down and said, we have 2 options right here. One is that we have to check my mom into a mental facility to get more tests done and figure out what's going on. Or 2, my dad and I were going to leave because, when you live with a parent with Huntington's disease, it can take a toll, not just on the person with it, but the family too. And that's why I always believe it's a family diagnosis, because it does impact everyone. She wasn't happy with those choices, of course, but she was willing to go to the mental facility. And that's when they ran a bunch of tests and determined, oh, she has Huntington's disease, and was the first in our family. So of course that's new to us because we know there's usually family history. So my mom's one of four. Her three other brothers and sisters got tested, all tested negative. We figured out it was her dad who had it, but we think he might have been in that gray area, which I know it gets a little confusing, but essentially he may have not had it, but that he could still pass it down. So kind of the CAG repeat, that doesn't show that you have HD, but that, your kids could still be at risk. That's just our guess, because according to my family, he wasn't showing symptoms and he was perfectly fine. And so that's where it kind of all started, was 15-year-old me trying to learn about it, going to Google, which we know never really helps. It does help in some sense because you learn about it, but it's also quite scary when I saw all the symptoms and saw that everything my mom was dealing with lined up with this disease, and that the average lifespan is 10 to 20 years and there's no cure. I think the challenge was not only trying to come to accept this as a part of my life for the rest of my life, but at the same time trying to fit in with my peers in high school, which, it's always a tough time to try to fit in. And then I have a mom who is sick, and I'm like, people aren't going to understand it. So I was embarrassed being out in public with her or having friends over. And so it was just very challenging for me. And it wasn't until, a few years later where that's when I decided to learn more about it. And then 5 years after learning about it, went through genetic testing at the age of 20 and found out that I also tested positive for it.
Would you say, when you first learned about your mom's diagnosis of HD, would you say that was a relief that you finally found an answer to the issues, or in your mind, did that make it worse, knowing what you had learned about the disease leading up to the fact that, it is going to get progressively worse? There is no cure. Do you remember what was going through your mind and kind of that, that range of emotions?
Yeah, I was definitely an angry child growing up, to be honest, which, surprises some people today, because they're like, Seth, you an angry person, or like you lashing out, like that just doesn't seem like you. But I think it was kind of saying, okay, why did this happen to my family? Like, what did we do to deserve it? And then kind of like, yeah, how do you deal with it? I was in so much denial about it, and I just didn't want it to impact my life. So I was trying to, still be a typical high school kid, playing sports, hanging out with friends. I ended up picking up a few jobs, staying after school, just to kind of stay away from the house. And it wasn't because of my mom. I think it was just because of trying to accept this disease that's going to take over her and her life, and it's going to change my family's life. I think that was the challenging part. It was a relief to know what was going on, because again, the other option was that my dad and I were going to leave, and I feel like I would have a lot more guilt if we ended up leaving and finding out later that she had it, saying, wow, we could have done something. And so, yeah, I was definitely, just quite upset about it, and angry about it, just because I just didn't want to accept it. And I guess you could say I was going through that grief and loss stage, right? I was in the, angry part of it and being in denial. And then I don't know really what hit me in college that made me be like, oh, wow, actually, I'm at risk. I think one part of it had to do with my biology class junior in high school, and doing those Punnett squares, and, talking to my teacher about it. And, what I was taught, it was not the right thing, which was, the father usually has the dominant genes. And so because of that, I'm in the clear. And that's, of course, not how it works. And so when I realized that, I was like, oh, wow, I'm at risk, and I could end up like my mom one day. So what do I do now? And that's when I decided I want to get more involved. I want to host a fundraiser. I also kind of wanted to make up for lost time because, to be honest, like I was so upset that I ended up, taking it out on my mom because I just didn't understand it and I didn't know how to cope with it. And so it was a challenge. And I think the guilty side of me is saying, how do I not fix the past, but how do I kind of help improve it for today and for tomorrow?
How did that, once you learned that your mother had Huntington's disease, how did that change your role as a caregiver? Like now, obviously you now had access to maybe different professionals, or different tactics or approach. Whereas before you're kind of managing the issues, like you said, and it was getting to the point where, you and your dad were thinking about leaving. What was the shift then like? And how does that, relate to some of the work that you're doing now, with youth that are going through some of those similar transitions?
Yeah, so I think, a couple of things is, my dad being the main caregiver, and he was there through the whole time, through the good parts and not so good parts. And, my hat goes off to him because, seeing that and him, when I was growing up, him being like a role model to me, made me realize how important life is and how you need to just appreciate the little things. And I think, my sister would of course, help out when she came back from Arizona. But, when I was in high school, and that was kind of the meat of things, like when it was started to get really tough, I would have to take her out for errands. I would have to take on more responsibility at home. And so it felt like I was growing up a lot faster than my peers. And so even though I'm 30 now, I feel like I have such an old soul because I had to grow up a lot faster. And I've talked with a lot of people in the HD community and just who deal with any rare or chronic condition or even just any adversity. You grow up a lot faster and you just appreciate life and you understand, what you need to do for yourself, but also the people you care about and you love. So my caregiving role, like it was just kind of helping out my dad or my sister with my mom and whatnot. But I think what changed is when I tested myself, it got a lot tougher for me mentally because when you see your loved one go through it and you say, wow, that could be me, it gets quite scary. And what I mean by that is, so my mom, she passed away 6 years ago. She was 60 years old. She ended up in a nursing facility. And I remember like, my sister would come home usually during the summers because she was a teacher, and she would be like, why aren't you going to visit mom more? Like, why aren't you going? And I just was like, I don't want to. But deep down inside, it was because I feared seeing her and seeing myself in her being like, this is tough, right? Especially towards the end of it, it kind of made me realize, wow, this could be me one day unless I do something about it, unless I take action. And that's kind of what stemmed me to get more involved in the HD community. I won't, at first getting involved with HDSA, eventually getting on the board for HDO, and now, to this day, really working with, early stage biotech companies that have a focus in HD, or just trying to figure out, how do we advance research through my own story and the story of many others who are either A, at risk and are deciding to test, B, like me, or pre-symptomatic, but have tested positive, or maybe are even early symptoms. And what I mean by that is maybe they have the cognitive and psychiatric piece of it, but not the motor symptoms yet. And how do we get their voices heard when it comes to research?
Yeah, I'm curious too. So you went through all of this, and then you ultimately came to the decision for yourself to get the genetic testing. At what I would, what I think or consider, fairly early age, at the age of 20, which is, a period in most people's lives where they feel invincible. You're at that college age, nothing's going to bother me. And you talked about it a little bit where it's kind of maybe the less I know, the better I am, the ignorance is bliss kind of approach. Talk about what really, you know, finally prompted you to make that decision for yourself, and how you kind of carry that message forward. Obviously the choice to get tested is an individual one, and there are people that should be involved in that. But for you specifically, the process you went through to get to that decision point, and then, how you communicate that to youth today.
You're absolutely right in that genetic testing is such a personal decision, and it shouldn't be based off of anyone else except for your own decision. But what I would say is making sure you have the right resources and support when figuring out if you have Huntington's disease or any other kind of genetic condition. I know, with kind of just some stats that I think it's about only 10 to 15% of people who are at risk for Huntington's disease actually decide to go through testing. And I understand that part because they're like, there's no treatment, there's no cure. Why do it? For me, it was kind of like I wanted to know my future. I wanted to know what the future entailed, and how can I use that to my, I guess, advantage of preparing for life with or without HD. I think what was going through my head was really, as I dive deeper into understanding HD when I was in college, seeing kind of the list of symptoms, and then resembling, I guess, my mom in some ways, whether it was dropping a phone, forgetting an earlier conversation. It was very easy for me to just say, oh, is this HD or not? Is this HD or not? And I kept thinking about that, where it was just mentally draining. And I wanted to know, so I didn't have to worry about it anymore. I mean, at the end of the day, like, it most likely wasn't HD, but in my mind, it was like, oh, it could be. It was probably just me being a typical college student and not realizing that. But what I decided to do, and I share this in a TEDx talk that I did in 2018, is that, I went in pretty much by myself. I got a referral from my primary care physician to a neurologist. Went in, talked to him about the family history. Two weeks later, went back, and that's when he told me I tested positive. I didn't go through genetic counseling, which I always recommend people today to do because it's such a valuable resource. I had a friend who was in the waiting room, but not in like the doctor's room. And I recommend having a friend as even family, because the other part was I didn't tell my family for a few years. And that was my own personal decision because I didn't want them to worry about me. And I also didn't want my mom to ever find out because I didn't want her to feel guilty. Luckily, she didn't. But then I realized the importance of telling them. Told them a few years later. They understood. They support me. They love me. Same with my friends. And I realized that, with all of this, that you'll realize who your true friends are, which are those that aren't going to treat you differently and aren't going to define you by your condition. They're going to be the ones who see you for more than just HD, and that they're going to, appreciate you based off your values, interests, and, personality.
Yeah, you in that TEDx talk that you mentioned, you told a really cool story about your dad's reaction and how nervous you were going into. I was wondering if you do it much more justice, if you wouldn't mind sharing that with folks. I thought it was a really cool reaction.
Yeah, so I think that was such a nerve-wracking situation, telling my dad as well as telling my sister about this big news. And one thing I didn't mention in my TEDx talk is I will admit need a little liquid courage, because I was like, I don't know what he's gonna say, how he's gonna react. And at the time I walked into my living room. My dad's watching TV. He's probably watching the Red Sox. He's a big fan of that. And I told him I had something important to tell him. He kind of looked at me and said, all right, what is it? What do you need to say? And I said, hey, I tested positive for Huntington's disease. And he just kind of looked back and was like, all right, sounds good. Like, he was so nonchalant about it that it kind of caught me off guard to be like, all right, like, you don't have any questions? Like, what's the deal? But I think it was just kind of his positive outlook on life. And I think also what he learned just as a caregiver to my mom was just kind of like, hey, researchers are making great progress and that there's going to be something sooner rather than later. Now that was, I was going to say that was about 7-8 years ago. And yes, research has been amazing. Oh, I've learned so much about all these different companies working in HD, but I think now is the time to also take that next step of reframing that mindset of, hey, we can be hopeful, but feeling hope is not going to necessarily move the needle. Acting with urgency will. And that's kind of my new message today is how do we act with more urgency for treatment options and making sure that we can slow this down, halt it in its tracks, or even reverse the course.
Yeah, so that's a great point for follow-up. So 20-year-old Seth Rotberg has been tested. He knows his outcome, and a couple of years later, told friends and family. So now you've gone from having been involved in activities kind of in support of your mother's diagnosis to now knowing that you want to do something for you. And you talked about the urgency and in terms of timing with everything with the community currently with recent trial outcomes. Yeah, there is a sense of urgency. So talk about how after the diagnosis, after you told everybody, what was the motivation then, and how are you taking that, communicating that level of urgency into action, a plan of action now, and steps going forward to help people that are going to start entering that same phase, that same transition that you did, several years ago?
So I think the first thing is like understanding, you can't do everything for everyone. And what I mean by that is like, I wanted to do everything. Like I didn't know how to say no to things. And so I was like, oh, you want me to share my story? Sure. Oh, you want me to do this fundraiser? Oh, you want me to volunteer for this? I was saying yes to everything because I just wanted to help everyone. And I realized at the end of the day, if I can't help myself first, it's going to be tough to help others. And so that was like one of the biggest kind of lessons I've learned even more recently is, one, it's okay to say no. And two, like focus on a few things versus trying to do 100 things that are kind of at a lower level. And so, once I was more open with it, I think I really focused to trying to support more young people. That's why I joined the board for the Huntington Disease Youth Organization, was because I didn't want anyone to go through the similar experience as myself. I knew that they had a lot of great resources and educational content, and I wanted to make sure people were aware of that. And also just the idea of connecting with another young adult is very different than connecting with an older caregiver or an older person living with HD. And I remember the first person I met was right before I went through testing when I was in college. Someone who lived down the hall said her friend was coming, that her mom has HD. And as soon as I met her, I just felt like I could let my guard down, just be myself again. And there was no feeling of being judged. And I just was so open with her. She was actually the person that came with me for my genetic test results. And, I think that's something that I'm still passionate about, is making sure young people are aware of, they're not alone in this. There's a lot of other people going through, whether they're at risk, they tested positive, even tested negative. I have some good friends who have tested negative, and I tell them, hey, I appreciate you that you are still involved in this community, because I get with some people, they test negative, they're like, all right, I'm out of this. Like, I don't need to worry about it anymore. But then I'm kind of like, well, what about me? And what about everyone else that you built a relationship with that are still dealing with this? And so like, I do have a good amount of friends who have tested negative and are still fighting by my side or for me, and for their loved ones and for their friends. And I appreciate that a lot, because we need as many people to continue to advocate. But to kind of shift over to the research side of things, I think one thing I've been continuing to learn about is that someone like myself doesn't qualify for any of these trials. And I'm talking more, interventional trials where it's taking a treatment or not. Of course, I do participate in Enroll HD and any other trials that are more observational. But part of me thinks, if I'm considered pre-symptomatic, but the goal is to stop the, condition in its tracks or slow it down, then I need to be in some capacity involved in these trials. And the reason I say that is because we know right now to be diagnosed with HD, it's mainly due to motor symptoms. But we've also learned more recently that you can see changes in the brain and the cognitive symptoms 15 to 20 years ahead of time. So it's someone like me who's 30 now and say, okay, I might start developing motor symptoms in my early 40s, similar to my mom. So, has the cognitive parts already happened? It's possible, but I think that's why I want to start acting with more urgency is how do we look at the diagnostic criteria? How do we make sure that people like myself and others can participate in these trials, as well as, help, develop these potential treatments by getting their voices heard in these companies early and throughout drug development. That's something that I'm still passionate about, is understanding that with advocates like myself, like if you're coming to us, after you're trying to recruit, to me, you're not going to be as successful as coming and saying, okay, what is the most burdensome parts of the symptom of the condition? What are the most burdensome symptoms of the condition? What about the trial design? Any other protocols? Oh, you're part of a patient advocacy organization. Oh, could you, help pass this along about these upcoming trials? Things like that. I know there's, it's a lot easier said than done. And I know companies have to go through, legal, compliance, regulatory. But part of me is kind of like, okay, do we need to educate them on the importance of talking with the community early and throughout drug development? Because, if we take a study that's saying you have to come in once a month or even once every other month, let's say once a month, right? That's 12 days a year. May not sound bad, but if someone like me who's working full time, that means I got to take 12 days off of work, possibly more for follow-up visits. And then I don't have any time for me, for self-care. And so it's how do we kind of make sure that we're aware of some of these challenges that might be faced, or how do we make things more decentralized and more virtual so that it could be a simple checkup via an app on my phone or a Zoom call, right? Or anything that's virtual, so that someone like myself doesn't have to come in for a follow-up visit, or we can make it a little more manageable. So these are just things that kind of come to my mind of saying, how do we rally up the community so that we bring more of this urgency of saying, yeah, HD impacts someone for 10 to 20 years, but I don't have 10 to 20 years to wait. I don't even have 5 years to wait. I want to, act now by not just sharing my story, but the story of many others who are living with HD.
So, and these are really fantastic points. I absolutely agree with that. In your role in advocacy, the work that you have done and are currently doing, have you had conversations with industry, and what types of obstacles have you encountered, or potential successes have you found so far in getting them to understand the potential for getting pre-symptomatic patients involved in these studies, or understanding the time commitment? Like you said, if it's a monthly visit, it doesn't sound like a whole lot maybe to somebody managing the books, but depending on your location or your job situation, like you said, that's an additional 12 days off a year that you may only get 18 days a year to take off. And, if 12 of those are for study visits, you essentially only have another week to enjoy, your own personal vacation.
Exactly. I think with industry, right? Some of them get it, some of them don't. And that's not to knock off any of them. That's just kind of what I've seen over the last, even just the last few years. And what I mean by that is like those who are bringing in the community perspective and the right people, they understand it, whether they're doing focus groups, advisory boards. Some of them are doing market research, but then it's like, are you getting the right audience to answer your questions, right? I've seen a lot of even these surveys that go out, and I'm like, oh, maybe I'll help out, right? But then it says, are you diagnosed? And technically I'm not. So I'm like, do I fit the criteria or not? And then if I do say, yeah, I'm diagnosed, they say, well, what are your symptoms? Well, I don't have symptoms. But that doesn't mean my voice isn't important, because one day I might be taking that treatment. So you need to understand my perspectives or people like myself. So I think when it comes to that, it's, that's the whole goal for these patient advocacy professionals within industry, to build these relationships, not just with the nonprofits, but I think there's a whole new market of like patient advocates or patient influencers. If someone goes to HDO or HDSA or Help for HD or any of the others, right? That's one thing, but I'm not involved necessarily with any of them. So how do I get my story out there? And there's a lot of other people like myself who aren't directly involved with patient advocacy organizations who have a really good insight into the community. So I think when I think of like getting that feedback, it's not just patient advocacy organizations, it's also these advocates who are out there who have been involved in some capacity, or who are knowledgeable of the community, who can provide that sense of feedback as well. But it takes a village, right? It takes all of us to kind of work on this together, and to really, bridge that gap between the community and industry. When it comes to someone, for me to get involved in these trials, that's something I'm trying to learn about. I'm saying, what are the barriers of having someone who is pre-symptomatic involved? Part of it could just be the risk, right? I'm not technically showing symptoms, but part of me is like, well, maybe there needs to be different biomarkers to look at, different endpoints to look at. Maybe there's an experimental endpoint to look at, where then you can extend the trial to people like myself who may not fit the first time around, but can fit the second time around. Because again, like I say, like if they're not working with people who are, this pre-symptomatic stage, and they're trying to slow it down, well, by the time I'm showing motor symptoms, to me, that's too late. And so that's where I think we need to try to revisit how to, diagnose. And I'm not the expert. I'm relying on the researchers, neurologists who are in the field of how do we look at the diagnostic criteria. I know there's another organization who has gathered data from the community saying, yeah, we need, to figure out how to also look at cognitive and psychiatric symptoms, because they're so important.
Right.
And so it's cool to see that the community is coming together for something like this. I think some of industry understands it and they support it. I think we can continue to get the buy-in of other companies to say, hey, we need to look further into this. But I'm just one voice. I think just getting more people, and there are plenty of people out there who are in a similar boat who say, I want to do something now and I want to help make a change.
What do you say to those people like that? So, somebody out there who wants to get involved but isn't exactly sure how to, or what their best role is. Is it something that's based on the person's personality, or is there a standard set of, standard skill set that you think somebody who can be a successful advocate, should possess? Or, is it purely a numbers game? The more people, the more voices you have, the better off you think it'll be?
I think it's about making noise, right? I mean, I think it can be through podcasts like this, people blogging, people sharing their story in a variety of different outlets. And even on social media, right? Of bringing this up, because, I posted a blog post about kind of this hope and urgency piece, and several people said, how can I join? How can I get involved? Right. And to me, it's saying, okay, well, you also share your thoughts on this. or, hey, maybe some people are like, hey, I just want to be behind the scenes, or I want to just volunteer. And that's where, I also recommend volunteering for a nonprofit organization and getting involved that way. It could also be, reaching out to these, industry companies, their patient advocacy team, and saying, hey, I'm interested in learning more. Can you spare me 20, 30 minutes? Or, hey, I want to share my story. In that case, again, my personal belief is that if someone is sharing insight, which is their story to industry, that they should be compensated. But that's probably a whole nother podcast. But, I think there's plenty of ways to kind of get that message out there. I think going through the patient advocacy organizations, sharing your own personal story, and I've seen it, but kind of just continuing to make noise. And I think that's by making also these nonprofits be aware of the challenges so that they can also help fight with us, kind of be on the battlefield, I guess, next to us. And then I think it's also making industry, not that they're not aware of it, but more aware of it, of the urgency piece. And I think also even the FDA, right? I think, and that's just more for the US based, the Food and Drug Administration, making them aware of, some of these maybe cognitive psychiatric symptoms that come before the motor symptoms. How do we diagnose earlier? How could we maybe bring them into trials in some capacity, depending on what we're aiming for when it comes to treatment options?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually going to ask you if you felt that there was a regulatory aspect that is potentially a barrier, because somebody who's pre-symptomatic, it's in the eyes of what the FDA is looking at, it's kind of hard to prove if there's been improvement if nothing has changed. But what you're saying is exactly that. Like I want to stay pre-symptomatic, I don't want to get into into the symptoms. And that sounds like that is potentially the challenge too.
Yeah, there's definitely a challenge there. And I think it goes back to like the biomarkers. And, again, I started looking more into cognitive biomarkers. I know two that kind of come to mind is the neurofilament light chain, which there was a study on, I believe last year. And then there's the striatum. And I think both of those we need to keep stable, but they can show changes in kind of that cognitive piece. I know, with psychiatric symptoms, it can be a little bit more challenging because of how do you evaluate it? How do you differentiate it? Just having a bad day, right? Versus is this a symptom? And so I think if we can at least start with cognitive, right, that can help. With just feeling independent, right? That my mom lost her independency. She lost, she had to give up her license. And I think, that can be very challenging on someone to feel like, hey, I can't be as independent. I have to rely on others, especially when you're not perhaps elderly or you're not in like a nursing facility. So there is probably a regulatory challenge. I think that's also where, part of me just thinks when looking at companies and their regulatory or their legal and compliance is, maybe they need to be in these conversations too. The people I talk to is not necessarily them, but maybe they need to be more aware and bought into the community to know, hey, we're not trying to, break the rules. We're just trying to help. And if we are too strict on it, then we're going to be too slow in trying to advance research. And so how do we get our message to them as well as just to any stakeholder who, has some type of hand in the cookie jar when it comes to the HD community?
Absolutely. Seth, I did want to ask you too a little bit about, you talked about working with nonprofits and the the impact that they can have, and you actually went back to school to get a degree in nonprofit management and have kind of taken that to the next step currently. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're currently focused on with the Our Odyssey?
Yeah, sure. And it's interesting because I decided I wanted to go back to get a master's in nonprofit management. And actually, one of the first classes is they explain, why it's not a good idea to start your own nonprofit. And then here I am doing that. And I can understand why. I mean, nonprofits need to be run by like a business, right? I mean, you're raising money, you're pushing out programs. I mean, you could say programs are like a business's product, right? You're providing a service. And so I think you gotta look at a nonprofit like a business. And I'll be perfectly honest, like never thought I was gonna start one. I think the reason behind it was because there's this unmet need with young adults who were impacted by a rare chronic condition that were, between the ages of 18 to 35. I looked at kind of the cancer model of young adult cancer patients and survivors. And, I noticed that there was data out there, there's support out there, there's organizations out there. But then when I looked in kind of, more specifically the rare disease space, there's a lot of these great patient advocacy organizations, including HDO, but there wasn't like an umbrella organization that supported young adults living with any condition, because with some of these rare diseases, the closest person could be across the country or even across the world. But what we've learned is that you don't need to have the same condition to have the same experience or a similar experience of how do you navigate college or figure out your career plans or family planning or dating or talking with friends about it, being financially stable, right? And I think, of course, all those things are challenging, but then add a health condition and it makes it a lot more complex. And so I just decided to ask young adults themselves. I said, would you be interested in connecting with other young adults? Would you be interested in in-person events, virtual events? And after, young adults from at the time, from 65 different health conditions saying, yeah, I would love to do this. I was like, well, got to do it then. Got to make it happen, because if I don't do it, then who's going to do it? And so, our Odyssey was founded 2 years ago to really provide that year-round support versus the one-off approach, because that was the other challenge that I've noticed, was that organizations would have like a one-off event or a big conference, convention, and it was awesome, right? I'd be, I'd go to the HDSA convention and I'd, reconnect with my friends and catch up with them. But then after a few days, convention's over, back home, and all right, I'll see you next year, right? And I think that was the challenge to me, is because I just felt like, oh wow, I got to wait a whole year for me to see them again. And I felt like, how can we make this more year round? How do we provide more events, whether it's in person or virtually, so young adults can stay connected throughout the year, get that peer-to-peer support, and really help improve their quality of life? And so that's kind of what we're trying to do now with our Odyssey, is provide that sense of belonging, make sure young adults feel that, feel connected to each other, and then try to also provide some resources to them. And it's not necessarily our own resources. It's not reinventing the wheel. So if there's an organization out there that has a great resource, we're going to say, hey, check out this resource from so-and-so organization. Like, I know there's like Global Genes and the National Organization for Rare Disorders, also known as NORD. A lot of great resources. We're not going to, create our own. We're going to say, hey, check out their resources that they've provided that might be useful or helpful for you along your kind of health odyssey per se.
Right. You, taking it back to something you covered earlier in our conversation, you talked about someone you had met that you felt you could just easily talk to, and she ultimately accompanied you to your genetic testing. Have you found that that's been the case, bringing together youth, even across different rare diseases, that they are, that they instantly make those connections, and it doesn't have to be disease specific or symptom specific or issue specific?
Absolutely. I mean, that, I at one point thought, oh, is this just me that enjoys this? Because I started going to these health conferences, meeting other young adults, and being like, wow, we can connect on a whole nother level. Like, they get it. And I just, again, felt like I could be myself again. And it's not that my friends or family judged me. It's just like, I think there's a difference between like living with a health condition and kind of being on the outside of it. And so when I met all these other young adults, I was like, oh, this is awesome. Like, they're all really cool, and easy to talk with and connect with. And, when I saw that they were connecting with each other, I was like, okay, there's something here that is bigger than just me. It's not just me who enjoys these social connections. It's a lot of other young adults. And I think the big thing is that I learned is never assume what's best for them, right? Your community or whoever your target audience is, or that you're trying to support, simply just ask them. Say, hey, are you interested in this? Or hey, we're gonna put out a quick survey and see, um, you know, if what we're thinking is good for the community is similar to what the community thinks too. Now, again, it goes back to you can't please everyone, right? Especially with some of these larger organizations who can only do so much. And I've already learned that, right? I mean, some people have individual needs that we just can't support. And we explain that to them. We say, hey, like, we're a small organization. I do this full time as a volunteer. We have one part-time staff member. We have a lot of great volunteers and board members, but again, we can only do so much as a small organization. And so we try to remind not just our community about that, but ourselves too, of managing those expectations and understanding, like, let's start small and grow from there, but let's do it strategically as well.
You have a motto that you live by, and as I understand, and I've seen the picture, you have a tattoo of it on your back. Can you share the origin of that, and how it drives what you're doing now, and how it kind of permeates, what you're doing in the community?
I never thought I would actually get a tattoo, to be honest with you. I think it just kind of came to me, I guess, one day. And I'll give the backstory. So, I was a senior in college. It was the day before my last semester when a good friend of mine, Jake, unexpectedly passed away. And it was very challenging because I think that was the first time where, like, I lost a friend that was around my age, especially when it was, again, the unknown. And no one likes the unknowns, right? That's why I went through. That's honestly one of the reasons why I went through genetic testing. I mean, you think about with COVID, right? There's so many unknowns. It gives people anxiety. It gives people mixed feelings. There's just unknowns of this, unfortunate circumstance. And, I didn't know Jake too long, to be perfectly honest. I only met him the year before, but I felt like our, friendship seemed a lot longer because we just understood each other. And he was always kind of living in the moment and enjoying just life and living life to the fullest. And there's the quote that you referenced that's a tattoo on my back. It's live as if you were to die tomorrow, learn as if you were to live forever. And it was in his high school yearbook. And then it was on his, like, headstone. And I think I saw that quote, and not only did I think of him, but I also was thinking kind of living just in the moment and understanding my own circumstances, understanding, like, my mom was kind of living in the moment, even though she was, suffering from HD. And so that's kind of what I try to live by each day. Of course, some days are tougher than others. I'm not that invincible kid that we all wish we were. But, I try to accept it and understand it, reach out to my support system, my resources, and then remind myself that tomorrow is a new day. And I have to remind myself of that, especially, these days, with everything going on in the world, as well as just with HD and how it is slowly creeping up year after year, where I might end up with symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, that's got to be does that weigh on your mind more than anything, or is it something that's kind of a passing thought from time to time? I'm curious, like you said, like early on, you said you might drop a book or something and think, oh, is that HD, or is that, do you still dwell on that, or, does it just depend?
I definitely do. I mean, it not as much, right? Because I got to remind myself that I'm only in control of so much. But, from time to time, even like, not that my friends meant to do it, but like out and about, and, they jokingly, oh, like, what are you drunk, right? Like, and for me, it's kind of, it's a trigger of, wow, okay, like, no, I'm not. And that, you know, is something that people would say to my mom. Or it's like, oh, how did you forget that earlier conversation? I was like, I don't know, I got brain fog, like I can't multitask. And so it does get to me at times, for sure, of like just thinking about it and thinking, is it a symptom or not? But I've been able to manage it more, to just kind of accept it and understand that it may or will happen. But if I keep trying to plan for the future, I'm not going to enjoy what I have today, right? Because that is, yes, I am a planner, and yes, I want to plan ahead. But what I've learned is that the more I try to plan, the less I'm able to just enjoy what I have today. And I think, my friend Jake taught me that, and several other people, to make me just appreciate life. And that's why, I went to Costa Rica one year, and I went bungee jumping, and went to Nepal and did a 10-day trek with a friend, and really just trying to enjoy what I have today, so I can look back at life. But, at the same time, I want to be able to have a family one day, and make those memories, because a lot of my memories of my mom are when she was sick, unfortunately. And so I want to make sure that I do have enough time for that, to have these good memories. But, I just think, as much as I do stay hopeful, I need to stay realistic with life of what may happen. And I think that's where I wouldn't say I'm feeling the pressure, but feeling more of that urgency mindset of saying, okay, like, what can I do now to help bring change, or help, make noise in the community, to say, hey, like, we need to do something now. We can't just wait around for these companies and be on their timeline. They need to be on our timeline as patients.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, your story is absolutely fascinating one. It's very inspirational. It really is a story in resilience. I do want to give you the opportunity, if there's anything else you want to add, but I want to make sure that, it is there somewhere that a website or somewhere that people can go if they want to get more information about the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so I think there's, not to add too many websites, but but they can go to my own personal website, which is just sethrotberg.com. There's no H in my last name, so think of it as Rot and then Berg. Or they can go to ourodyssey.org. Either of those, I'm more than happy to connect with people, whether it's around nonprofit work, community involvement, just wanting to collaborate, whether it's, again, with the nonprofit or with HD related work. That's something I definitely am trying to do more of. And it's not just with the community. I want to collaborate with any stakeholder involved in HD, neurologists, social workers, physicians, industry, right? Like, whoever, researchers, right? Whoever wants to really help take this initiative with me, as well as, many others. Let's do it now. Let's not wait for another 5 years, because, again, I think we need to start acting now. And honestly, I look at two different communities who are starting to, who have made noise, or are starting to make more noise. One is the AIDS community, right, with the AIDS epidemic back in the 80s, right? They pushed the agenda, and they said, hey, we need to do something now, right? And they were able to make it happen. And now the ALS community, I feel like, is doing very similar work, where they're saying, hey, we can't wait around. Like, we need to make things happen. And so, again, for me, it's always about not reinventing the wheel. It's how do we learn from these other communities and apply it to the HD community to say, hey, let's work together, and let's make something happen now.
Well, Seth, I appreciate you joining us, and we will put those website addresses in the podcast description, so people can click on those and make sure they have the right spelling and all that. But I appreciate you joining us today, and we look forward to chatting with you many times over the years to come in the future, and help push for that urgency that you mentioned.
Yeah, thanks again, Kevin. I do appreciate you having me on the podcast, and looking forward to collaborating again in the near future.
Well, that'll do it for the special video edition episode of the Hdinsights podcast. I certainly hope you enjoyed hearing from Seth as much as I had listening to him talk about his personal experience with his mother, his decision to undergo genetic testing, how both of those life experiences have shaped him over the years, and the urgency that he's really pushing for on behalf of the HD community. I mentioned during our conversation the full websites that Seth talked about, ourodyssey.org and sethrotberg.com, are included in the description section for this video, so you can click on them to learn more or get involved with Seth and his work. You can also find more information about the Hdinsights podcast by visiting the Huntington Study Group's website. That's huntingtonstudygroup.org. Or you can search for it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcast, or on our streaming platform, which is podbean.com. Once you find it on whatever device you prefer, subscribe to ensure that you always get the latest episodes downloaded immediately when they initially come out. So until next time, thank you for listening to the Hdinsights podcast. Stay safe, be well, and take care of one another. The Hdinsights podcast is brought to you by the Huntington Study Group. Episodes are produced and edited by Kevin Gregory. Dr. Daniel Clausen is the chief editor of Hdinsights. Janine Mercandetti provides voiceover support, and Emma Grushkin handles graphics and animation.